Welcome to another episode of Buddhist Spirituality, where we explore the timeless wisdom of the Buddha and its relevance to our modern lives. I'm so glad you could join us today as we delve into a topic that touches every aspect of our human experience: suffering. Now, I want you to take a moment to reflect. Have you ever wondered why suffering seems to be such a persistent part of our lives? No matter how hard we try to avoid it, suffering always seems to find its way back. Whether it's emotional pain, physical discomfort, or the inevitable challenges of life, we all face suffering in one form or another. But why? Why does it seem so inevitable, so recurring? Is it possible that we are meant to live with suffering forever? Or is there a way to break free from it? And if there is a way out, what does that path look like? How do we, in a world full of uncertainty and difficulty, find peace, stability, and understanding? These are the questions we'll be exploring today, drawing from the teachings of the Buddha. In Buddhism, suffering, or dukkha, is considered one of the core aspects of existence. But here's where it gets interesting. Dukkha is not just something to endure passively. Buddhism teaches us that suffering isn't the end of the story. In fact, it's often the beginning of a profound transformation. Think about it. What if suffering wasn't something we needed to escape from, but something we could learn from? What if, instead of running from pain, we could face it, understand it, and use it to grow in wisdom? Imagine if the key to finding peace wasn't about eliminating all discomfort, but about learning how to navigate the discomfort with a sense of clarity, compassion, and mindfulness. To some, this might sound impossible. After all, who wants to suffer? We're naturally drawn to seek pleasure and avoid pain. But in the Buddha's teachings, suffering is not something to be feared or avoided. It is a universal experience. But more importantly, it is an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to deepen our understanding of life itself. So, how does this work? How can we use suffering as a tool for personal growth, rather than something that merely causes us to feel stuck or defeated? Today, I invite you to join me on a journey to explore the profound wisdom embedded in the Buddha's understanding of suffering. We'll take a deep dive into the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha's guide for navigating the ups and downs of life. These teachings offer us not only a roadmap for understanding the nature of suffering, but also practical tools for reducing its impact and cultivating a mind that is at peace, no matter what life throws our way. Let me ask you one more question before we dive in. What if suffering is not the problem at all? What if the problem lies in our reactions to suffering, in our resistance to it, and in our attempts to avoid it at all costs? Imagine, instead, that we could approach suffering with a sense of openness and curiosity, instead of fear or aversion. What would it be like if we could allow ourselves to feel pain without being consumed by it? What would happen if we could see each moment of discomfort as an opportunity to practice mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom? This is the essence of Buddhist practice. It's not about running away from life's difficulties or trying to escape them. It's about learning how to meet them with clarity, understanding, and a sense of inner peace. It's about transforming our relationship with suffering, rather than avoiding it or getting stuck in it. Now, as we explore these ideas together, I want you to keep an open heart and mind. The Buddha's teachings offer a way to live with wisdom, not by removing all suffering, but by understanding it more deeply. And in that understanding, we find the power to transform it. So, what is the first step in this journey? It begins with an awareness of suffering itself. The Buddha's first noble truth is dukkha, the truth of suffering. It may sound simple, but this truth is the foundation of everything that follows. Until we understand suffering, we cannot truly understand how to end it. Let's take a moment to reflect on what suffering really means. What do we mean when we talk about suffering? Is it just physical pain? Or is it something deeper, something mental or emotional? What role does our mind play in the creation of suffering? And, perhaps most importantly, how does suffering show us the way to true peace? As we dive deeper into the teachings of the Buddha, I encourage you to keep these questions in mind. How can I relate to suffering differently? And more importantly, how can I use this understanding to cultivate peace and wisdom in my own life? In the next part of this episode, We'll break down the Four Noble Truths, starting with the truth of suffering. But before we go any further, I want you to ask yourself one thing. What does suffering mean to you? Reflect on your own life, your own experiences, and see if you can begin to shift your perspective. Suffering is not just something that happens to us. It's something that we have the power to understand and transform. Take a deep breath, and let's begin our exploration of suffering. It's time to transform the way we think about pain, discomfort, and the challenges we face every day. Let's discover how the wisdom of the Buddha can show us the way. 1. Understanding suffering. In our quest to understand suffering, the first step is to grasp what it truly means. In the Buddhist tradition, the term dukkha is often translated as suffering, but its meaning extends far beyond mere pain or discomfort. Dukkha encompasses the full range of human experience, from the fleeting frustration of a traffic jam to the deep sorrow of loss, from the dissatisfaction of longing to the existential unease that accompanies the awareness of impermanence. At its core, dukkha refers to the inherent unsatisfactory nature of all things. But why is that? Why is suffering such an unavoidable part of life? The Buddha taught us that dukkha arises not only from the painful experiences we encounter, but also from the very nature of existence itself, which is impermanent, constantly changing, and conditioned by causes beyond our control. Think for a moment about your own life. Every day, we are confronted by the unpredictability of life. Our bodies grow older. Relationships change, sometimes unexpectedly. Our possessions wear out, and the world around us shifts in ways we can't always control. This is the nature of reality. All things are in a constant state of flux, and because of this, nothing can ever provide us with the lasting satisfaction we crave. No pleasure lasts forever. No material possession offers us ultimate security. This is the root of dukkha, the understanding that all things are impermanent, and this impermanence brings about dissatisfaction. But suffering is not just about pain. It's also about attachment. We become attached to things, ideas, and people. We develop preferences, attachments to what we like, and aversions to what we don't. We want things to stay the same, but they don't. We cling to the way we want life to be. But life moves forward whether we're ready for it or not. Consider a moment of joy in your life, a vacation, a celebration, a moment of peace. At the time, it might feel like everything is just right. But then, when the moment passes, there is a subtle sense of loss. We want that moment back, but it's gone. This constant cycle of craving and loss is the essence of dukkha. The more we grasp, the more we suffer, and the more we resist, the more pain we create for ourselves. In fact, the Buddha teaches that suffering isn't just confined to the obvious moments of pain. It's woven into the very fabric of our daily lives. Whether we're dealing with physical discomfort, the breakdown of a relationship, the loss of a loved one, or the frustration of unmet desires, suffering is always present in some form, but it's often subtle. It's the dissatisfaction you feel when you're constantly striving for something more, but never quite achieving it. It's the unease you feel when things are going well, but you can't shake the sense that something might go wrong at any moment. It's the low hum of anxiety that colors our thoughts when we think about the future, or the regret and sadness when we think about the past. And yet, despite this inevitable nature of suffering, we often try to escape it. We distract ourselves with entertainment, consumption, or even denial. We avoid situations that might bring discomfort, seeking only pleasure or security. But here lies one of the great paradoxes of life. The more we try to avoid suffering, the more entrenched we become in it. The more we run from discomfort, the more we experience a deeper sense of unease. Trying to escape the impermanence of life only serves to increase our suffering. This is why the Buddha's teachings are so radical. He doesn't suggest that we try to get rid of suffering altogether. He doesn't promise that we can live a life without pain. Rather, he teaches us how to understand and relate to suffering in a way that transforms it. Instead of fleeing from it or pretending it doesn't exist, we can face it with understanding, mindfulness, and compassion. So, let's break this down further. How do we recognize suffering in our everyday lives? It's easy to see when we're experiencing physical pain. a headache, an injury, or fatigue. But what about the more subtle forms of suffering? What about the discomfort that arises in our minds? How many of us experience mental suffering in the form of worry, fear, or dissatisfaction, even when everything seems fine on the surface? Take a moment and reflect on your daily life. Are there moments where you feel uneasy, restless, or dissatisfied, even when you can't point to any obvious cause? Maybe it's a vague sense of discomfort at work, or the tension in a relationship that you're avoiding addressing. Perhaps it's an ongoing worry about the future, or regret over the past. These are all forms of suffering that the Buddha taught us to notice. They are all part of the human experience. The Buddha's insight is not that we should eliminate suffering, but that we should learn to see it for what it is, a natural part of life, a consequence of the impermanent and interdependent nature of existence. The more we resist suffering, the more we struggle against reality itself. But if we can learn to accept suffering as an inevitable part of life, we can begin to transform our relationship with it. This brings us to a key point. Suffering cannot be avoided. It is an intrinsic part of life. No matter how hard we try to avoid pain or control our circumstances, suffering will find us. But here's the good news. Understanding this fact can set us free. By seeing suffering for what it truly is, we no longer need to fear it. We no longer need to run from it. Instead, we can approach it with mindfulness and clarity, learning from it and using it as a catalyst for personal growth and spiritual awakening. As we move forward in this episode, I invite you to let go of the notion that life should be free of suffering. Instead, let's explore how we can live with suffering, not as something to be avoided or feared, but as something we can face with awareness and equanimity. Because, as the Buddha taught, it is not the presence of suffering that is the problem. It is our relationship to it that creates peace or further pain. 2. The theory of dependent origination. To truly understand suffering, we must dive deeper into its origins. The Buddha taught that suffering does not arise in isolation. Instead, it emerges from a web of interdependent causes and conditions. In Buddhism, this concept is known as pratityasamutpada, or dependent origination, the idea that all things arise in dependence upon other things. Nothing exists independently. Everything is interconnected. And so, suffering is not a random event. It is the result of a complex chain of causes and conditions, each one influencing and sustaining the next. Let's start with an essential question. Where does suffering come from? To answer this, we need to look at the mind, at the way our consciousness interacts with the world. According to the Buddha, suffering is not an external force that is imposed upon us, nor is it something that is predestined. Instead, suffering arises from the interplay of our desires, our aversions, and our ignorance. The Buddha identified the key causes of suffering as craving, tanha, aversion, dvesha, and ignorance, avidya. These three are the root of our suffering, and they are tightly bound together in a cycle of cause and effect that sustains and perpetuates our pain. First, craving, the intense desire for things to be a certain way, whether it's the craving for pleasure, for security, or for approval. Our attachment to our desires leads to dissatisfaction. When we don't get what we want, suffering arises. Even when we do get what we want, there's a sense of impermanence, knowing that it will inevitably slip away. This creates a constant undercurrent of unease, a longing for something more, something better. This craving for permanence in an impermanent world is one of the primary sources of dukkha. Next, aversion, our resistance to what we dislike or fear. This includes our desire to push away pain, discomfort, or any experience we find unpleasant. Aversion is the other side of craving. While craving pulls us toward what we want, aversion pushes us away from what we don't want. Both are forms of attachment. We become trapped in this cycle of pushing and pulling, wanting and resisting, unable to find peace because we are constantly fighting with reality. And then, there is ignorance, the root cause of craving and aversion. Ignorance is not simply a lack of knowledge. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of the true nature of reality. It is the failure to see that everything in life is impermanent, that nothing is permanent or unchanging. Ignorance is what causes us to cling to things, to believe that our happiness depends on external conditions, or that we can permanently secure our desires. It's this misunderstanding that fuels both craving and aversion, locking us in the cycle of suffering. So, how does this all work together? The Buddhist teachings on dependent origination reveal a deep, cyclical process. Our ignorance leads to craving. Craving leads to attachment. Attachment leads to suffering. This cycle continues, perpetuating itself until we wake up to the reality of its nature. But let's explore how this cycle works. Step by step, it begins with ignorance, the misunderstanding of reality. Ignorance gives rise to volitional formations, or mental habits. These are the habitual ways we react to the world. From these mental habits, consciousness arises. We begin to perceive and interpret the world through the lens of our desires, aversions, and misunderstandings. Once we have consciousness, the six senses, sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, and the mind, begin to interact with their respective objects in the world. These interactions are what the Buddha called contact. When contact occurs, feelings arise, feelings of pleasure, pain, or neutrality. These feelings further condition our reactions, deepening our attachments or aversions. Now, this cycle doesn't stop here. The feelings that arise lead to craving. We crave the pleasant experiences and try to avoid the unpleasant ones. This craving leads to clinging, or attachment, which is where the suffering truly takes root. Attachment creates a false sense of permanence, and when things inevitably change, as they always do, we experience distress. This is how suffering perpetuates itself. But here is the hope in all of this. Because dependent origination is a chain of interconnected causes, it is not a permanent, unbreakable chain. Every link in the chain can be transformed. If we can uproot ignorance, the chain of suffering begins to dissolve. If we can shift our perception, see through the illusion of permanence, and recognize the impermanence of all things, the craving, the aversion, and the attachment will begin to fade. In Buddhism, one of the most powerful insights is the recognition of impermanence, the understanding that all things arise and pass away. This includes our suffering. The Buddha taught that everything, no matter how intense or painful, is temporary. This is the principle of samsara, the cycle of birth and death, of coming into being and passing away. Suffering is born, it grows, and it eventually fades away. Everything follows this pattern, just as the sun rises and sets. Our experiences of pain and joy, of suffering and happiness, are all part of a natural cycle. The key here is to understand that nothing lasts forever, including our suffering. It may feel as if it's never-ending when we're in the midst of it, but in reality, it's always changing. This is why the Buddha encourages us not to react with fear or resistance when we face suffering, but to acknowledge it with awareness and patience. Just as a storm eventually passes, so too will our suffering if we allow it to unfold and fade naturally. The principle of birth and death, coming into being and passing away, these are the natural rhythms of life. And just as suffering arises, it will eventually cease. This cycle of creation and dissolution is not something to be feared. Rather, it is the natural order. Everything in the world is subject to this law of impermanence. And the Buddhist teachings help us understand how we can live in harmony with it, rather than resisting it. So, while the cycle of suffering is an intrinsic part of life, it's not something we must remain trapped in forever. The Buddhist teachings offer us a way out, not by escaping reality, but by understanding the causes of our suffering and learning how to disengage from them. Through awareness, mindfulness, and compassion, we can begin to break the chains of ignorance, craving, and aversion, and in doing so, free ourselves from suffering. 3. How to live with suffering. As we explore the nature of suffering, a profound question arises. How can we live with suffering? After all, it is not something that we can simply escape or avoid. The cycle of birth, growth, decay, and death, of joy and suffering, is a part of the fabric of life. So, if suffering is inevitable, how can we not just endure it, but transform it? One of the key teachings of the Buddha is that we can indeed live with suffering, not by running away from it, but by facing it directly. The path of mindfulness and wisdom provides us with the tools to understand, transform, and even transcend suffering. But how exactly do we do this? The first step is mindfulness, the practice of paying attention, of being fully present in each moment. Mindfulness is not just about noticing our thoughts or sensations, but truly engaging with them, without judgment or attachment. It's about observing what arises within us, whether it's joy or pain, with a sense of openness and curiosity. Why is mindfulness so important in the face of suffering? Because suffering often arises from our reactions to the present moment. When we feel pain, whether physical or emotional, we instinctively want to push it away. We resist, we fight, we distract ourselves. This resistance, however, only intensifies our suffering. The more we struggle against the pain, the more it grows. But mindfulness teaches us that the pain itself is not the problem. It is our aversion to the pain that causes us to suffer more. Imagine this. You are experiencing intense emotional pain. Perhaps it's the sorrow of a lost loved one, the frustration of a difficult relationship, or the anxiety of a challenging situation. Our natural tendency may be to avoid these feelings, to distract ourselves with work, entertainment, or even anger. But what if, instead of pushing away the discomfort, we simply allowed ourselves to feel it fully, without judgment, without resistance? In that moment, instead of becoming overwhelmed by the pain, we begin to transform it. By acknowledging the suffering without fighting it, we begin to break its grip on us. Mindfulness allows us to see the impermanent nature of our emotions. Just as clouds pass through the sky, so too do our feelings pass through our minds. They come, they stay for a time, and then they fade away. By simply being aware of them, we allow them to move through us, without letting them define us. But mindfulness alone is not enough. To truly live with suffering, we must also cultivate wisdom, the ability to understand the true nature of reality. This wisdom is what enables us to see that suffering is not a personal attack on us, but a natural part of the human condition. We must come to understand that everything in life is impermanent. That pain, like all things, will pass. This recognition brings a deep sense of peace, because we no longer cling to the idea that our suffering is permanent. It is not. Nothing lasts forever. Let's consider how we can apply mindfulness and wisdom in our everyday lives. In our work, for instance, how often do we find ourselves stressed, overwhelmed, or frustrated? When we are under pressure, the natural tendency is to react, to get angry at the situation, to blame others, or to retreat into our own frustrations. But what if, in those moments, we took a pause, simply breathing in and out, and observed the feelings arising within us? What if we asked ourselves, what is this feeling? Why is it here? And allowed it to be, without judgment. In doing so, we shift from reacting automatically to responding with awareness. We gain a new perspective, one that allows us to navigate challenges with greater clarity and calm. Mindfulness helps us to break the cycle of reactivity, allowing us to approach difficult situations with patience, empathy, and understanding. Similarly, in our personal relationships, mindfulness can transform how we interact with others. Think of the times when we feel hurt, misunderstood, or upset in our relationships. Our immediate reaction may be to blame, to shut down, or to lash out. But if we practice mindfulness, we can pause before reacting. We can take a step back and observe our emotions. Why do I feel this way? What is the source of this pain? Is this pain coming from within me, or is it truly from the other person? By taking this moment to reflect, we create space between stimulus and response, allowing us to respond more skillfully and with greater compassion. This is the power of mindfulness. It is not a way to avoid suffering, but a way to meet it directly, with awareness, with compassion, and with wisdom. The more we practice mindfulness, the more we train our minds to see suffering as part of the flow of life, not as something to fear or resist. In this way, we begin to live more freely with suffering. We learn that it does not define us. Instead, It is a passing cloud in the sky of our consciousness. The key to living with suffering is not to make it go away, but to understand it, to face it, and to respond to it with awareness and compassion. Through mindfulness, we can transform the way we experience pain. We don't need to fight it. We don't need to escape it. We simply need to allow it to be, with the wisdom that it too will pass. And this is where true freedom lies, in the ability to live fully, with both the joy and the sorrow, the light and the dark, knowing that all things, including suffering, are impermanent. 4. Liberation is not escaping. Throughout history, the concept of liberation has often been misunderstood. Many people believe that liberation means to escape from the pain and suffering of life, to run away from the challenges, the hardships, and the discomforts that come with being human. But is that really what true liberation is? Is it about fleeing from suffering? Or is it about something deeper, something more profound? In Buddhist teachings, liberation is not about running away from life, but about understanding life as it truly is. It is about awakening, realizing the nature of things, recognizing the impermanence of all things, and seeing through the illusions of our attachments and desires. Liberation, in Buddhism, is not found in escape, but in clarity, in the ability to see and understand the world as it is, free from the distortions created by our desires, aversions, and ignorance. Imagine, for a moment, that you're trapped in a dark room. You've been in that room for so long that you've become accustomed to the darkness. You can no longer see the walls, the corners, or even the door. In this darkness, you begin to feel a sense of helplessness, anxiety, and fear. You may believe that the only way to be free is to run away, to escape the room altogether. But what if the key to liberation is not escaping the room, but simply turning on the light? What if all you needed was to open your eyes and see that the door was always there, right in front of you? This is what liberation in Buddhism teaches us. It's not about leaving the world behind or escaping into a distant realm of peace. It's about seeing the world clearly, seeing its impermanence, its fleeting nature, and its interconnectedness. The more we understand the nature of things, the more we can live freely within them, without being enslaved by our fears, desires, or attachments. In other words, liberation is not about avoiding life. It's about engaging with life fully and mindfully, without being caught in the traps of delusion and suffering. Now, let's pause and think about the difference between liberation and what many people might call escaping, the tendency to avoid or shut out the unpleasant aspects of life. In our daily lives, how often do we attempt to run away from the things we don't like? We might distract ourselves with work, entertainment, or even substances in an attempt to numb the discomfort of our emotions or circumstances. We try to ignore the truth of our feelings, of our struggles, and of our fears. But in doing so, we don't actually eliminate the suffering. We just bury it beneath layers of distraction, hoping it will go away. But it never does. Escaping suffering may feel like a relief in the short term, but it only deepens the cycle of dissatisfaction. The Buddha taught that the root of suffering lies in our attachments to pleasure, possessions, and even our own identity. When we avoid facing our suffering, when we push it away, we reinforce those attachments. We're not dealing with the underlying causes of our pain. Instead, we're simply shifting our attention away from it, allowing it to fester and grow in the background. True liberation comes not by avoidance, but by facing our suffering directly, by understanding its origins and learning how to respond to it with wisdom and compassion. Think of it this way. When we run away from a problem, we often end up repeating the same mistake over and over again, because we've never truly confronted it. But when we face the problem, when we are willing to look at it, we open the door to transformation. The same is true with suffering. Liberation is not about escaping from our difficulties, but about transforming the way we relate to them. It's about recognizing that suffering is not an enemy to be defeated, but a teacher that can guide us toward deeper wisdom. True liberation is found in the freedom from attachment, freedom from the need to control every aspect of our lives, freedom from the illusion that we can somehow escape pain and suffering. By letting go of these attachments, We allow ourselves to live more fully, without fear of what may come. We learn to see each moment for what it is, not something to be clung to, but something to be experienced fully, with an open heart and mind. One of the most powerful aspects of Buddhist practice is the recognition that we can find peace in the very midst of suffering. Liberation is not about leaving the world behind. It's about seeing the world as it truly is, with all its challenges, its beauty, and its impermanence. When we cultivate this awareness, we stop running away from the realities of life. We stop trying to avoid discomfort, pain, and uncertainty. Instead, we embrace them as part of the human experience, as opportunities for growth, insight, and transformation. This is what it means to live with wisdom. Wisdom does not promise an escape from suffering. It promises the ability to see beyond it, to understand its nature, and to approach it with equanimity. With wisdom, we recognize that suffering is not a permanent state. It's a transient condition that, like all things, will eventually pass. We don't need to avoid it or escape it. We simply need to be aware of it and respond to it with clarity and compassion. In this way, liberation becomes a way of being in the world, fully present, fully aware, and fully engaged with life. Without fear or attachment, we are no longer running away from what is, but moving toward it with a deep sense of peace and understanding. 5. Real-life example. To truly understand the teachings of the Buddha, sometimes it's helpful to look at how these profound insights play out in the lives of ordinary people. Let me share with you a story of someone who, through their practice, transformed their suffering into an opportunity for deep spiritual growth. This is the story of Mai, a woman in her mid-40s, living in a bustling city in Vietnam. Mai had a good job, a loving family, and what seemed to be a comfortable life. However, despite all these external appearances, she carried a deep sense of dissatisfaction, a feeling that no matter how much she achieved, something was always missing. Her life, though outwardly stable, felt like a constant cycle of striving, with moments of brief happiness followed by long periods of anxiety and worry. Mai had suffered a great deal in her younger years. She had lost both of her parents at a young age, and this loss left a deep emotional scar. As she grew older, she found herself constantly seeking for something outside of herself to fill the void: a new job, a new house, a new relationship. But despite her best efforts, the emptiness always returned. This cycle of seeking and never fully finding peace wore her down, and eventually, she realized that her suffering wasn't just coming from her external circumstances. It was rooted deep within her mind, in her constant attachment to things, to people, and to ideas about how life should be. It was at this point that Mai encountered Buddhism. She had always been curious about spirituality, but had never seriously considered its teachings. One day, she attended a meditation retreat on the recommendation of a friend. At first, she was skeptical. She didn't know if meditation could really help her. After all, she had tried so many things to find peace. But something about the retreat felt different. The silence, the mindfulness, and the teachings of impermanence began to resonate with her in ways she hadn't expected. On the third day of the retreat, during a period of silent meditation, Mai experienced a breakthrough moment. She had been sitting in meditation, focusing on her breath, when a sudden wave of emotion overcame her. It was a deep sense of grief and loss, not just for her parents, but for all the ways in which she had been running from her feelings of abandonment, fear, and longing. In the past, she would have tried to push these emotions away. She would have distracted herself or avoided confronting the pain. But in that moment, something shifted. Instead of pushing the emotions aside, she decided to simply be with them. She allowed herself to feel the grief without judgment, without trying to escape or change it. For the first time, she experienced the depth of her pain without resistance. And in that moment of surrender, she realized something profound. The pain was not something to be feared. It wasn't an enemy. It was simply a part of her experience, a transient feeling that arose and would eventually pass. The suffering was no longer something to be avoided, but something to be understood, accepted, and embraced with compassion. Over the following months, Mai continued her meditation practice. She began to apply the teachings of mindfulness to her daily life, noticing the moments when she became attached to her desires, her worries, and her fears. She learned to pause before reacting, to breathe deeply and observe her thoughts and emotions with a sense of detachment. She realized that suffering wasn't something that could be avoided. It was part of life. But how she responded to it, that was something she could control. By practicing mindfulness, she learned to relate to her suffering with wisdom and compassion, rather than with fear and avoidance. One of the most profound shifts for Mai occurred in her relationship with her family. For years, she had struggled with guilt and resentment toward her husband, believing that his actions were the cause of much of her unhappiness. But through her practice, she realized that her suffering was not caused by him or by her circumstances. It was caused by her attachment to expectations and desires. She had been seeking fulfillment in others, in things, and in the way life should unfold, rather than accepting life as it was. Slowly, she began to let go of her attachment to how things should be. She started communicating more openly with her husband, expressing her feelings without blame. Instead of reacting with frustration when things didn't go her way, she learned to pause, breathe, and respond with patience and understanding. As she changed her relationship to her own suffering, her relationships with others began to shift as well. She found herself more present, more compassionate, and less reactive. The peace she had been seeking for so long was no longer something outside of her. It was something she found within herself. Mai's story is a beautiful example of how the teachings of Buddhism can transform our suffering into an opportunity for spiritual growth. Rather than running away from her pain or attempting to escape it, she faced it with mindfulness, awareness, and compassion. She learned that suffering is not something to be feared, but something to be understood. Through her practice, she was able to release the attachments that caused her pain and cultivate a deep sense of inner peace, not by avoiding life's challenges, but by embracing them with wisdom. As we reach the end of our exploration today, let's take a moment to reflect on the central message of this discussion. We've seen that suffering, often viewed as something to avoid or escape, is in fact a natural and unavoidable part of life. But in Buddhism, suffering is not seen as an enemy. Rather, it is a profound teacher, a teacher that offers us the opportunity to grow, to awaken, and to deepen our understanding of the true nature of reality. Through the teachings of the Buddha, we have come to understand that the very root of suffering lies in our attachments, our desires, and our misunderstandings about how the world works. But the Buddha also showed us a path of mindfulness, wisdom, and compassion that allows us to transform our suffering into an opportunity for spiritual growth. Much like the story of Mai, who faced her grief, fear, and attachment with courage and mindfulness. Each of us has the potential to do the same. Life will continue to present us with challenges. There will be times of pain, frustration, and loss. But what we do with that suffering is what truly matters. Do we react with resistance, fear, or avoidance? Or do we meet our suffering with acceptance, presence, and the willingness to learn from it? As we practice mindfulness and cultivate wisdom, we begin to see that suffering is not a permanent state. Just like everything else in life, it is temporary. It arises and passes away. What matters is how we relate to it, how we transform it into an opportunity for growth, understanding, and ultimately, liberation. The Buddha's teachings provide us with the tools to do just that. So, I invite you, dear listener, to embark on this journey of transformation. You don't need to go anywhere to find peace. You don't need to run from your pain. All you need to do is turn inward, develop mindfulness, and embrace your experiences with wisdom and compassion. When we learn to be present with our suffering, we open ourselves up to deeper insights and a life that is more peaceful, more balanced, and more fulfilling. Remember, liberation is not about escaping from life's challenges, but about seeing them clearly and responding to them with wisdom. The path is not always easy, but it is always available to us. Right here, right now, as you continue your journey, may you find the courage to face your own suffering with clarity, compassion, and the deep wisdom that comes from knowing the truth of how things are. Thank you for joining me today on this exploration of suffering, mindfulness, and liberation. May you be well, may you be happy, and may you find peace in every moment of your life.